If you're a law student or you want to be a lawyer, you'll know that we're in the thick of law firm application season right now. One of the most common problems in law firm applications causing you to fail is a lack of commercial awareness. So today, joining me to help you learn how to improve your commercial awareness so that you can see success this application season, we have LawByJames.
Pleasure to be here.
As you know, I'm a future trainee solicitor and James is currently a commercial paralegal, and we're going to be giving you our top tips on how to become more commercially aware, including talking about some of our favorite commercial awareness resources. So James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess the first question we should really start with is, what is commercial awareness? How would you define it?
I think commercial awareness is this kind of buzzword that is often really overhyped by law applicants. And I think when you just really simplify it down, it is quite a simple concept where I think it is essentially just staying up to date with current trends affecting businesses and essentially interpreting how those trends are then in turn affecting law firms as well.
I actually totally agree. Like, that was the first word that I wrote down, was just buzzword. I feel like it's just what you say. It's all about being aware of what's going on in the business world and knowing how that affects both law firms and their clients. I guess maybe that feeds into another question that we could get into now, which is, why do we think it's so important to show commercial awareness in our law firm applications?
When you do really just deep and understand the concept of why firms want to know that you are commercially aware, it's because you're going to be dealing with these sorts of current affairs and business trends on a daily basis. So if you're not understanding the basics of commercial awareness, commercial trends, then you're going to struggle on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're going into a large city commercial law firm.
100%.
So I think that is ultimately why I guess firms are expecting you to know not the insides and out and be a Financial Times presenter, but have I guess the minimal understanding to understand certain conversation topics, and so you're not literally sat in a room having no idea what typical current affairs are or certain sort of terms that you should be understanding.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, because at the end of the day, firms are hiring you to ultimately help their clients, and clients of law firms want the law firms to give commercial advice, and essential to that is commercial awareness. So if the lawyers need to show commercial awareness and you want to be a lawyer, you're going to need to show commercial awareness as well. One of the biggest questions I seem to get asked all the time, and I'm sure you probably get asked it a lot too, is what my biggest piece of advice would be to somebody who is looking to develop their commercial awareness. Obviously, I think this is quite a massive question that I might have just thrown on you, but do you have maybe a top tip or some idea of where you would tell someone to start when it comes to developing their commercial awareness?
Yeah, do you know what? I think the most typical advice that I always hear, and it is good advice, is to obviously start reading the news and like listening to the Financial Times and whatnot, which I think is really good advice. And I think having that as part of your daily routine, like listening to the Financial Times podcast or BBC Business is a great way to kind of slowly learn through like osmosis. But one of the biggest, and I guess it's slightly unique advice, is actually going through and having some form of like a business yourself. So for me, for instance, I think the way in which I think naturally so sort of commercial is because I started having my own businesses from such an early age. So I started a law tuition business whilst I was in my undergrad, and then I also had a video editing business as well during lockdown. And so naturally on a day-to-day basis, I was thinking a lot more sort of from a client's perspective rather than like a law student perspective, looking at sort of daily trends, for instance, of how that could affect how I was increasing my profits, or looking at competitors, for instance, and seeing what they were doing and how I can sort of tailor my own business to sort of be more competitive and sort of leading within whatever industry that I was in. And that's not me saying like go and start off multi-million-pound businesses and just to understand commercial awareness, but it might just be like a small side hustle, or even, for instance, like selling on Vinted, for instance. And this sounds a little bit crazy, but on a day-to-day basis, like say you're at an event, for instance, like say you're at a concert, think how that is affecting the area that you're in. So say you're at a Taylor Swift concert, for instance, rather than thinking and sitting there like, oh, this is great music, think how or what laws or what sort of opportunities for law firms that are presented and the legal sort of behind the scenes that are happening. You've got contract rights for the stadium, you've got IP rights for the music, contracts for all the workers working behind the scenes, and sort of employment lawyers that are, you know, happening behind the scenes with that. Slowly getting into that mindset, I think, is the best way that I've ever developed my commercial awareness.
I think that's actually so interesting. That's not even something I've ever considered, but it's such an interesting approach. I love the idea of considering businesses you interact with in your daily life and the commercial aspects of that. And like you say, commercial awareness isn't just reading the Financial Times and knowing the most up-to-date legal and financial news. Getting to know how businesses operate and the legal and commercial implications behind that can also be developing your commercial awareness. I think that's a great approach, and I also think it touches on what I was going to say. My biggest tip when it comes to commercial awareness is being consistent. Like what you said about constantly thinking in your daily life about the practical and legal implications of things for businesses. And that's what I think is my biggest tip, is consistency in that. As much as we would all want to, we can't force commercial awareness. It is a skill that is honed over time, and it will get to a point where there's a shift away from, like you say, actively thinking about Taylor Swift concerts and the contracts behind that, to where it just becomes a subconscious norm in relation to everything in your life. Building off the back of that, are there any commercial awareness resources which you recommend?
I think the ones that I use on a daily is things like listening to the Financial Times bite-sized podcast, because with that you don't have to carve out a section amount of time to go through and read. People are extremely busy, like students, or, you know, if you're working and doing law firm applications alongside that, you just do not have the time sometimes. So I'd recommend podcasts. I'd also recommend having a look at, I think, two of the biggest sort of resources that I've been using is Little Law and also Zip Law as well. And I think the reason why they're so good is because a lot of people fall within the trap of commercial awareness of just reading the news and thinking that they're commercially aware for that. That literally break down every single sentence and says how this affects the clients, but then more specifically as well how this affects law firms. So I think those sorts of resources are a lot more user or law student friendly, as opposed to sitting down and reading the Financial Times.
I think that's actually quite funny that you brought up those resources, because the resource that I had written down as well was also Little Law. Like you say, it's a great resource. Just if you don't know what it is, it's this free newsletter that sends you email that basically just keeps you in the loop on commercial news. And I did meet the founder of Little Law at an event, and he's also a really nice guy.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, it actually helped me, even though I thought I was commercially aware. Reading the stuff that he's putting out just helped me go that much further. And honestly, I feel like if I had that when I was applying to law firms, it would have been so much easier. It just breaks it down exactly into, like you say, not just what the news is, but also how that affects law firms and their clients. So I think while we're talking about law firm applications, a really good question I like to ask as many people as I can, to be honest, is can you remember a commercial awareness question that you've been asked in any of your applications? And if so, how did you go about answering it?
One of the most standout commercial awareness questions that I've been asked, the question was something along the lines of, what is a trend that current CEOs are facing? But then the follow-up question for that was, how can the firm sort of aid with this issue and provide solutions? And so, first of all, there's a lot to unpack in that question. It was tough, yeah. And if you weren't prepared, you would literally just be sat there, just protrusively sweating, not knowing what to really say. So the first part is obviously knowing what actual trends CEOs are facing. And so looking at more specifically the client sort of point of view rather than just law firms. So typical things could be like AI, for instance, and how companies are adapting to, you know, that digital framework. That's one avenue. But then the second, I guess, commercial awareness part of that is being commercially aware from the law firm perspective and understanding specifically the firm's practice areas and sector focuses, which you'd only be able to know if you research the firm. And then third of all, or second of all, I don't know what part I'm on at the moment, but then interpreting that and then understanding and saying on paper or within the interview, how can a firm provide a solution to that client using prior examples of cases, again, which you would only know if you really deeply research the firm. So that was the most crazy question that I ever asked in an interview. I've never encountered anything quite like that if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think that one was an awful question to get jumped with in an application process, but also a very good way to tackling it. Very logical and very well thought out. So, I don't know how I personally could have answered that any better. I'm glad I wasn't in your position, to be honest. I remember I got asked the classic question of, can you think of an issue that our clients need to be aware of? This was obviously a couple of years back now, and the firm I was applying to had a very big presence in the aviation industry. So obviously, like you said, it's so important to go in well researched. And my mind went blank. And the only thing I could think of was that my parents really needed to go abroad. And it was that time when we had that whole traffic light system, some green, amber and red lights, and depending on which countries you could travel to. This feels like a whole lifetime ago now. Obviously for the aviation industry at the time, this was a very, very hot topic. So I talked about that system and how clients needed to be preparing and adapting for the fact that overnight, a whole load of their business could just get banned and they would have to deal with that. And I was talking about how law firms had a role to play in helping clients through that, as clients want specific tailored advice. And if law firms and lawyers aren't going to give that to them, they will just go to a different law firm because that's not meeting their objectives. So it's like you said, knowing the law firm's industries and the clients that they represent is so important. One thing I would say is that if you do get a question similar to what I had, they're probably asking this question to loads of people. So try and be as original with it as you can. I personally would completely ignore the COVID pandemic now. It's just so overdone. It's just not doing you any favors unless you can bring some radical new angle to it. Try and think a little bit outside the box. They're probably going to see like 50 people say the same thing. And by the end of the day, they're just going to be like, yeah, okay, whatever. I say just avoid COVID at all costs. It's so overplayed at this point.
100% agree with that. I think from speaking to some recruiters myself, because at the end of the day, you're competing with thousands of applicants. And if they're reading the same stories and the same sort of points every single time, you're not going to stand out.
Yeah, I guess that's what it all comes down to, is just try and be a little different. Because like you say, for most of the top law firms, they're getting thousands and thousands of applications. So you need to stand out. The final question I had written down was, what should somebody do in advance of an interview on the commercial awareness front?
Just being prepared all the way throughout. And so ideally not cramming commercial awareness, because like you said, you can't really cram. If you are kind of feeling like you're being put on the spot in interviews and you can't naturally come to logical conclusions yourself, that is probably because you aren't prepared enough. So all the way throughout the application season, and even if you are unsuccessful within this or last year's application cycle, making sure that you're still continuing those efforts to be commercially aware. If you start cramming commercial awareness and you're trying to sort of cram all these terms, you're not going to have a deep understanding of it. You're going to have a very surface level of understanding of it. And when you start getting quizzed on that, you're going to have absolutely no idea. So yeah, I think that's top tips.
Yeah, I totally agree. The only thing that you can do with commercial awareness is build it consistently over time. Obviously now we're at the beginning of application season, so you're in a great position to look at what is trending in the legal industry and see where those trends are going. One thing I really like to do is to use LinkedIn as a news source. Even just looking at some of the webinars which law firms are putting on and the titles of those webinars, you can see what is trending in the legal industry and you can read around that subject, becoming more knowledgeable on it. That will help you so much when it comes to interviews, as you'll be able to respond when quizzed on it, which is obviously the end goal.
Yeah, I didn't have any other questions or anything to add, unless you do, James.
No, I was just going to add on the end of that as well. I think another really good resource that I discovered is firm social media. So apart from LinkedIn, looking at things like Instagram, a lot of firms now have Instagram pages where they put out some of the recent cases that they've worked on. But yeah, also paying attention, and this was a huge one, I think, for me in terms of standing out, was firm podcasts. So often they're going to discuss some of their recent sort of either their cases or even down to things such as the firm's resources, such as any legal tech that they have. And they'll usually do a deep dive on some of the more sort of niche topics that aren't sort of frequently as discussed on LinkedIn and Instagram. So yeah, definitely is like a sort of final point for me. Definitely sort of utilize things like Spotify, Instagram, because it's always worth just doing a quick search to see if firms do have, you know, Instagram pages or podcasts and things like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great tip, like you say. So James, thanks so much for providing so many useful insights. I mean, I know a lot of law students are going to find this so useful going into application season now. If people aren't following you already, where can they find you?
TikTok at LawByJames, Instagram as well. I think that's LawByJames as well. I should probably know. Yeah, TikTok and Instagram.
Hopefully this answers a lot of your commercial awareness questions. Make sure to follow for more on law, careers, and the SQE, and drop a comment with your favorite commercial awareness resource so that everybody can share their favorite resources and benefit from each other.